Welcome to another episode of the Corrosion Journal interview series. My name is Sammy Miles, the Managing Editor-in-Chief of Corrosion Journal. Today, I'm excited to continue our editor roundtable discussion from last month. In our last episode, we discussed the current state of corrosion research, and today we're going to focus more on the future. I'm joined by Dr. Arjan Mol, Co-Editor-in-Chief of Corrosion Science, Dr. Sanna Virtanen, Technical Editor of the Corrosion Science section of the Journal of the Electrochemical Society, Dr. Nick Birbilis, Co-Editor-in-Chief of Materials Degradation, and Dr. John Scully, the Technical Editor-in-Chief of Corrosion Journal. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
So to kick off our discussion today, what changes do you think we'll see in the future corrosion research, and what do you think some of those big research areas will be in a few years?
Thanks, Sammy, for this kind introduction and indeed the great opportunity to discuss with my colleagues and share our thoughts and views on current and future trends in our exciting research times. So last time, indeed, we discussed a bit the upcoming research topics, including computational modeling, in situ integrated, say, electrochemical, spectroscopic, and microscopic techniques in one very hostile environments that we are facing also for the future. And there we touched upon indeed the big drivers such as materials and energy transition requirements, well, leading us to use different energy generation, storage, transport, and use requirements. And we can think about geothermal applications, photovoltaics, hydrogen-based power technology, wind energy applications, etc., which all need to operate at demanding conditions. So high pressure, aggressive chemicals, high temperatures, etc. And when we think about, say, strategies towards low carbon technologies, we can distinguish different energy needs, say, or technologies, solar photovoltaics, stationary storage and networks, including smart grids, low carbon mobility applications, and wind power. And some of the materials that we are currently using are not abundantly available for different reasons, just because they are not out there, or for geopolitical reasons, not always easy to spread around the globe and to be used where we actually want to use them. Think about silver and cobalt. So cobalt is considered unavoidable for permanent magnets and in mainstream batteries, also for future applications. And the demand for cobalt increased sharply, with batteries accounting for less than 30% of the total demand in 2000, but 60% in 2019. And so not only the corrosion research field, but I would say material science and engineering in a broader sense, is crucial for the energy and the materials transition, and includes the needs for material substitution, lowering the use of critical materials and elements, novel recycling approaches, and those will all highly impact, I think, the corrosion research topics and strategies for many years to come. So indeed, when we talk about big research areas, I would say one of them is at least the one for materials in novel energy applications.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So this is Sanna Virtanen from University of Erlangen in Germany. So certainly the energy technologies are really bringing many new corrosion challenges for materials. And of course, energy is one of the big challenges of our future. Corrosion in general, of course, is in the middle of the whole development of or considerations of sustainability, so sustainable material science or sustainable society. And therefore, corrosion that can take place actually everywhere. As soon as a metallic material is not in a vacuum or so, we will mostly have some kind of surface reactions with the environment. And of course, in worst cases, these reactions are really detrimental, and safety issues and such come into play, in addition to, of course, just losing resources by unnecessary corrosion. So corrosion research will continue going on forever as long as metallic materials are being used in different type of applications. So corrosion research will never stop, in my opinion, and well, rust never sleeps, as we know. So in addition to energy, of course, we have other big challenges. So energy, and then, of course, all the environmental considerations really are big topics, but also health. And in all these challenges of the future, we also have corrosion challenges. So what exactly will be the big questions in corrosion research in the next years, or even for longer term considerations, depend, of course, a little bit on the specific direction these fields will be developing into. But yes, we will have a lot of work to do. And fortunately, we are currently in a situation that we really have very good tools to work on these research questions. So both very high-level, sophisticated experimental techniques, and then, of course, all the data science and other developments and progress in computational and theoretical approaches.
Sanna, that was a wonderful description. This is Nick here from Deakin University. And look, one of the items we picked up in the first episode of our podcast was big data and data, emerging and eating up the world. And I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention some future trends in not just, broadly in computation, but I'll drill it down a little bit more when we're talking about specifically artificial intelligence. So at the moment, it's very difficult to not go a day of news and not hear something about ChatGPT. But these natural language processing models that sit behind these GPT tools are actually happening in the area of materials and the area of corrosion already. And so I thought I'd give an example from the journal that I work in. So a few years ago, our most highly cited paper was a review paper about chromate replacements and what the future might hold. It was based on, a cumulative knowledge of dozens of years of research experience from the authors. If you put up, the research experience and add it all up, it was many decades of experience and many hundreds of hours of literature review and reading and analyzing. Just last month, we published a paper that used the underlying principles in these GPT models, specifically the same technology that runs the Google search engine. And we asked it the question, what are the best corrosion inhibitors to replace chromates? And it was able to tell us very quickly what was said after dozens of years of research from researchers before. So being able to now ask simple questions and interact with the scientific community in a different way is really important. So I haven't tried this, but one could go to a GPT model and ask it, should I be using aluminium in nitric acid, or should I be using a certain grade of steel for a certain application? You'll get an answer. Now, I know Professor Scully is a real expert in this context and what the pitfalls are. You will get answers. Now, whether or not they're good answers right now, we don't know. We think they're probably not very good answers, but things are moving very quickly. And I think, it's a bit like this sort of Moore's law. So whatever GPT models tell you now, in about a year, they'll be probably 10 times better. In 5 years, they'll be 100 times better, right? And then we're really talking. And so, I also want to give another example, because an area that's emerging, and you can see it at these AMP conferences as well, is the use of smart detection tools. So things like computer vision, where through images, be it from cameras or videos or drones, you can do an automatic corrosion assessment as a visual expert would do. So using trained computer vision models to actually see corrosion without a human, and in some cases to be able to assess it. So things like crack lengths, crack widths, and so forth. And what's really interesting is those are completely different things to what we were doing before. And it sort of brings the research and practical and applied nexus a little bit closer, because we're seeing trends that relate to technology that's only sort of one sort of arm's length displaced from field deployment. And so that is also, bridging a little bit of a gap there. But look, I could talk about this forever. I think it's probably cognizant, though, to say that even though we have a lot of big data and a lot of things that we could be doing, there's plenty of pitfalls that we'll need to cover as a community. And I think we probably don't even have enough time in this podcast to do that. If I had one wish, to perhaps have avoided these pitfalls, and we can't change history, is if we had a time machine and could go back 100 years and had asked everyone to give their corrosion results in standard units in terms of molarity of electrolytes, units in which they reported corrosion rates and so forth, in which case the data that we actually have access to would be much more meaningful. But in some areas, even though we have access to data, we are starting from a standing start, because the way in which the data is prepared and the way we can access it isn't really what we need to build sophisticated models. So a lot of care still needs to be taken as we evolve into this sort of digital era.
Hello, everybody. This is John Scully, and I'm the Technical Editor-in-Chief of Corrosion Journal and Professor of Materials Science and Engineering at University of Virginia. Welcome back to our second podcast in this series. And I want to first reach out to Sammy Miles and thank her for organizing this. And also I want to reach out to our guests. We're really most fortunate and delighted to have you here. And this is a great conversation. I just want to pick up for a second and the interesting comments by Nick Birbilis about these expert systems and whether or not we could use ChatGPT or we could use some other capability to pick the best inhibitor that might be a replacement for chromate. And I just want to say that this is actually being done widely now. People are asking the question, for instance, if I ask ChatGPT, what do I need for a hypersonic material that instead of oxidation resistance at 800 degrees centigrade, I want to know what to do to get oxidation resistance at 3000 degrees centigrade, even if albeit only temporary. And so we're starting to say, well, I will look at all 15,000 publications on the subject, and they will tell me what the consensus is. And I don't know how that's going, but I've started to see some proposals written that have proposed doing that kind of thing. So we're in a new frontier, I think, where there's a lot of interesting things going on. And I don't think that'll be held back, but I do think there's some things to think about. One for the corrosion field that I think is true of all fields, but particularly for us, is data cleansing, or the quality of data. And as we know, the thing about corrosion being so complicated, we have all these environmental variables, all these physical variables, and then all these what I call materials or substrate variables. And so, as you know, what we measure, what we call a property, what we measure often depends on how we do the experiment in corrosion. So that adds to the complexity. So there will be a need for, I think, a big part of this, and you already see this in the business sectors, is a need for data cleansing and some way to sort the data. And then I'm still interested to see what will happen if you use a natural language approaches to, kind of come up with the best ideas in your research, and not have sort of traditional hypothesis-driven. The experts read the literature and see what the needs, gaps, and opportunities are. But you no longer do that. You now rely on, something that the carnivore that can read all the data. I don't know how that will go, but I will say one thing else. Another thing happening along these lines is that, as has been happening for a long time in pharmaceuticals, I think there's going to be a need for not only these kinds of things, but also something that can take high throughput data and have massive or very rapid data interpretation. So that's going to be a new frontier also for corrosions. The idea that you could gather 1 million data points on 1 million different inhibitors or 1 million different room temperature ionic liquids. You're going to no longer be able to analyze this sort of by hand, so to speak. And we see the same thing with material selection. Now material selection won't be able to do it using expert intuition. It'll have to be done by using not only relying on the data informatics, but also sort of high throughput experiments. And so that's an area. I also wanted to come back to some of my colleagues who had some great comments on sustainability. There's an increasing pressure and need to have a circular economy. The projections of the material use, even the 7 our 9 most basic elements, is only going to increase as time goes by. The projections into the future really look like there will be fantastic growth in the need for materials. And added on top of that is the complexity of our components. So just to consider that according to the Ashby sustainability book, that the light bulb used to have 5 or 7 materials in it, and the only one that was even critical at all was the tungsten. Right now, if you look at light bulbs, they have 23 materials in them. Smartphones have 50 some materials in them, versus an old dial-up phone had a couple of materials. Now there are 53 elements in the periodic table are in a smartphone, and 25 of them are on the critical materials list by the U.S. Geological Survey. And then we also have problems with that are more sort of social justice issues like the mining of cobalt, et cetera. So there's immense pressure on the corrosion field to play a huge role in the durability, but not only the durability in the recycling. So I think we need some new recycling methods. And just to remind you that electronic waste, like the kind of waste where you only have a few grams of gold, only a few grams of cobalt, such as in a smartphone, that the corrosion community is going to be needed to try to understand how you will retrieve these elements, how you will get the gold out of there. As you know, your CO2 footprint for doing this is much smaller than the primary metals production. And so I think there's going to be some new fields emerging that the corrosion community can spend a big part in. And there's going to be an editorial coming out in Corrosion Journal on this. But one is the emerging field of solvent metallurgy. So by using things like room temperature ionic liquids, which, by the way, there are over 1 million possible room temperature ionic liquids, and it's called the designer solvent. The society should be able to, if we're able to master this, we should be able to do solvent metallurgy, which is very selective recycling of elements and very selective removal. So there are some opportunities out there in our future that the corrosion community should play a role in, because a lot of it's just de-alloying principles where you take advantage of solubilization that is afforded to you by a room temperature ionic liquid. However, that's challenging. How would you go through a million different room temperature ionic liquids to find out the ones that are the most suitable for recycling cobalt or recycling nickel, or whatever it is, or recycling gold, even for that matter? And right now, there are actually 2 patents on recycling of gold, and they're both ionic liquids. I don't know if the community was aware of that. So I think that's a big area where, in order to have a sustainable economy, we've got to do well with do better, really, with the durability and the recycling part, and the corrosion community should play a role. So hopefully some of that will appear in journals, because as Nick said, I think that dissemination of information broadly, it's that kind of stimulus of ideas to the journals. All the journals and my colleagues here today can be beneficial to sort of spurring or stimulating the field. I'd also mentioned that a couple of other things are going on. That there's the cyber physical world. People talk a lot about cybersecurity, and that certainly is worthy. But there's some sort of the smart city concept is going to happen, and the question is whether or not water supply, for instance, is a part of the smart material monitoring. And I wanted to mention that I think it's in the Netherlands, Arjan, but there's already some groups that have worked on piping, what you would do to monitor piping to see whether or not you got some episodic event that was bad for the potable water. And so that's already been done. And then lastly, I'd like to say that there's always going to be new materials. There will be a new frontier for materials, and probably 5 to 10 years from now, it'll be different than the last one was. But I think there's a big opportunity for corrosion, not just to be an afterthought, but not just to be expert intuition, but I think there's enough data and enough science and enough rigor to what we do. And you see it in all the journals every day. There's enough rigor to be able to be on the ground floor of integrated computational materials design. So corrosion should no longer be on the sideline, but should be an integral part from day one in the design of materials. And so thank you for this great discussion, and I think I'll stop there.
Those were great points from everyone. I want to kind of go in, circle back to something that a few of y'all mentioned about kind of the challenges that we may face in the future. And some of what y'all were saying also made me think of the different pitfalls that we could fall into as we move forward with research. Do any of y'all have any comments on, what some of the other challenges that y'all haven't mentioned yet that may be on the horizon that people might want to try to plan ahead if they can? Not that we can all plan the future, but
maybe indeed. This is Arjan again. So thanks, Sammy, for picking up on this. I think we've covered already quite some ground. I think in different technologies, different new capabilities that we have been able to develop, and indeed, I think we are definitely at the forefront these days, I would say, of new developments for many applications, including those energy ones or health-related technologies. And I think indeed these computational capabilities also come with indeed pitfalls. I think, but also opportunities. There is, I think, in the past, when we compare it to predicting the weather, I don't think tens of years ago we were not able to predict the weather for the next day, and now we can predict, at least in the Netherlands, I'm not sure all over the globe, but we can pretty much predict for the next 14 days the weather. So I think the same will go for these computational tools that we have available. But I think we really should keep indeed our feet on the ground in that respect also. I think it provides a lot of capabilities, but then again, indeed also with the risk of trying to dig too deep, we come to the interpretation of things. So I think a critical attitude towards each other and including, I would say, ethical boundaries, and not only for the research, but also in terms of publishing and informing the general public in that sense. I think that's a big responsibility for our community there, and I think we all try to do our best to keep our eyes wide open rather than tightly shut there. So I think we have a big responsibility also there across the different journals that we are covering as a whole, but also in our public reach out.
Absolutely, and I would like to also a very short remark on related what Nick and John both already mentioned. So I found the example that Nick mentioned about asking ChatGPT this question and getting actually more or less the right conclusion. It's great, and I'm actually I'm a little bit I'm absolute no expert in these kind of systems, and quite originally I had a little bit like a rejective attitude. I thought that it's simply a little bit dangerous because I didn't really know how these things are going. And now I find it quite fascinating. And I think all the developments now in artificial intelligence and so on will have a great impact on our future and also on our research and other issues. What John mentioned is, of course, that corrosion processes are really quite complex. So it's really the material surface, it's the environment and the interface. There is it's really highly dynamic systems, and the surface and the interface are changing with time, and we deal with different length scales from atoms to really large scale macroscopic phenomena. So at least currently, it really still needs also human understanding to check what, for instance, these systems are giving, what kind of answers they are giving to us. But I think we should have an open attitude to deal with these systems and see how they can help us, and not go to the direction like there are some tendencies also just principally say no, it's forbidden to use these systems because they will have a huge impact. And if we deal with them in a good way, if we learn how to work together with, for instance, artificial intelligence, then it's going to be a very, very highly fascinating development, I think.
Sanna, this is Nick here, and I think you've hit it right on the head because you said the word human. I think Sammy's question was quite broad on what are the pitfalls. Now, clearly, as corrosion experts, we have a responsibility to make sure that people are safe. And as technology advances, applications advance, we will probably all have electric vehicles very soon. Who knows, in the future we may have flying vehicles, and the accelerated insertion of materials and correlating long-term response with short-term response still is a bit of a holy grail of a question. So I think we also need to remain human in our assessments, which I think Arjan had mentioned. And Sanna, I think you're dead right in that these AI models really should be expert systems that help inform a human to make a better decision. If you ask me, I guess what the one pitfall is, I'll take a different take on your question, Sammy, and I guess at the treetops level, every now and then there is a study published on the cost of corrosion worldwide as a proportion of GDP. Dating back, there's been several in the US. There was a recent one in China, but you could pick any country, anytime. And one thing that keeps me up, I think it probably keeps all of us up, is that the cost of corrosion as a portion of GDP is actually not dropping. It's been for the last nearly 50 years the same amount of the GDP, which means we still need to educate people. We still need to train people, and we still need to recover these, avoidable losses. So I guess education is also an important part of what we need to do, because that cost is not going down, and we continue as a community to often make the same mistakes. So I think a big pitfall would be continuing to not educate people in corrosion more and more and more. And that's an enduring mission, which I think AMP was set up to achieve, and we still need to do more.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, Nick, by the way. And it's from my perspective, right? I'm not doing any research on it, but when you look at the cost of corrosion versus if you had just paid a little more upfront and avoided so many of the challenges that was coming up at the AMP conference this year in Denver as well. I mean, it's in the long run, it's so much cheaper if you just have some foresight whenever you're going about your project, if you can. But I do think that education is a huge element. Dr. Scully, did you have any comments on some of the challenges?
I think one of the, just picking up on the point about the gross national product, and it's been quoted for over 60 years, what the percentages of gross national product. I don't think that's a compelling argument. So in terms of it hasn't been. What I'd like to do is offer a different idea, and that is, if you look at like the National Academy of Sciences report on grand challenges for society and for engineering and science, I think that the group here today has already done this. I think is that you won't have clean, abundant, renewable energy unless you solve a corrosion problem. You will not have clean water unless some of these corrosion products, and not to be hyperbolic and exaggerate, but I think that the corrosion in a lot of cases can be the showstopper. And in terms of what I can see on some of the Gen 4 nuclear reactors that we talked about in the last podcast, and not this time. If you go back to that, I think some of the materials issues are quite concerning. The basic fission part of it has been worked out, and the fact that there are huge advantages. They don't operate under pressure. You don't need to be under pressure like a hot water reactor, like a pressurized water reactor. And there's some inherent safety advantages. Some people say you already have a meltdown because the radium fluoride fuel is in the molten salt, so you can't have a meltdown per se. But I think the corrosion, it plays like a showstopper, roadblock type of view in a lot of these issues. And so I think that's one of our challenges, to continue to work with the messaging in order to convey that. But on the other hand, it's also not, if you look at the circular materials economy, it's not just end over end, more and more durability. You certainly, there's a time and a place for durability beyond our lifetimes. And with the nuclear waste, spent fuel nuclear canister, for instance, where you might want to go for a 10,000 year lifetime to, because at such point the radionuclides have decayed and you don't have as much radiation concerns. But durability really needs to be tuned to the lifetime of a device, and that's, I think, the point made in sustainability books that you see, coming out, such as Mike Ashby's book on sustainability. And what needs to be done is durability needs to be, sort of the right sense of durability. Like, for instance, take a smartphone. We talked before about the need to recycle the e-waste from that and the role the corrosion can play. But actually, the end of life for those devices ends up being, as consumer sort of driven. The iPhone, goes to the next model, and the previous model becomes. So you don't need material durability for infinity. You need material durability for the sort of viable functional lifetime of the device, driven by a variety of variables. And so the better the corrosion community can stay connected to every other issue, the better off the corrosion. And that's one of the challenges, to make sure we have like a seat at the table, make sure decisions on things are not made, in the absence of that. And certainly a part of it is to keep, to keep generating people educated from the corrosion field in order to play that role of having that seat at the table in these discussions. Because as we all know, it isn't going away.
I want to pivot slightly and really quickly touch on some of the technology. We've touched on the Chat GPT and some of those AI chatbot earlier. How do you think that technology will affect publishing and the way that we share and consume research as we move forward?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point of discussion, Sammy. This is Arjan, and maybe I want to throw in a few things here. And is that indeed these large language models or tools like Chat GPT, I think it should assist us, but not lead the way, or not completely to be relied on, I would say, when it comes, for example, to writing a scientific paper. Because it will help, but what it will not do really is to do some critical thinking or critical analysis and interpretation of data with a human eye to it. So I think they are very helpful, and indeed, and they are the way forward, and we should use them in many ways, I would say. But I don't think that we can do without the nuance that a human writer, for example, for a scientific paper crafting does, and well, they may struggle to generate text that is resonant or deeply insightful. So I think it will not lead the way, in a sense that ultimately we still would need the unique capabilities of human writers and input and make them irreplaceable in many contexts. I mean, the scientists that we are in the lead of writing scientific papers. So also as an entity, tools like Chat GPT cannot take on the responsibility and be accountable for anything that we do in our studies and that we publish and put out in the open to colleague scientists, and in particular also to the society as a whole. Given that, and what was very well mentioned by my colleagues here, all by Nick, by Sanna, and by John, indeed, that the complexity of the world that we are trying to understand and describe in terms of corrosion, understanding of corrosion and its protection, is so overly complex these days that as a scientific community we even have difficulty to grasp the complexity of it all, let alone, I would say, the society around us, without the specific knowledge that we have. So I think both in our scientific communications as well as the outreach to the public, we have a big task to fulfill. And indeed, Nick mentioned it very, very nicely. I think our role in education is something that our responsibility there will not decrease, but mostly increase. So topics like reflective engineering for material scientists in a broader sense, I think will be very important. So the constant awareness that tools that say computational modeling capabilities and indeed ChatGPT alike and the like are helpful, but hopefully not take away our responsibilities as humans as well as scientists. So I think that is something that I would like to stress.
I fully agree with you, and of course we as editors in journals must also really be aware of what may be happening in-house, for instance, an introduction in a research paper may be written in the future. So ChatGPT is really fast if you ask him a question, and of course it is developing all the time. So one thing is really, of course, in publishing, where of course now there's also a lot of discussions going on how to deal with these things, with these issues. And the second thing is, of course, also what we all are dealing with, because we are all university educators. So how will, for instance, ChatGPT influence teaching or, for instance, examinations at universities? So this is something that is it's been incredible, like from the first time when I heard this word, like for instance these chatbots and whatever, how fast these discussions got more and more, and we also, like here for instance in my group, we are discussing also, I mean, we are just like children playing with ChatGPT, but then also I think it's also our responsibility as more senior people maybe in the field to also maybe find a good way how to educate the next generation to deal in a proper way with these kind of tools.
Thanks, Sanna. You folks have covered that, I think, really, really well. And I guess, Arjan, you know, these aspects of whether or not there's reasoning in AI. Clearly there isn't reasoning, it can't do human level. But look, I'll offer what I think is hopefully an optimistic take on the question, Sammy, and how will technology change the way in which we ingest information. I'm going to come out with a bit of a confession, maybe not such a wild confession, but even I like watching a little bit of TikTok, especially before bed, right? And swiping through 30-second videos. I could do it all night. In fact, sometimes I do it all night. And I think it's probably high time that we think about engaging on that theme of education, engaging different demographics by different means. I think the technology provides us an opportunity to be able to do that, perhaps in a way that can be meaningful and at the personal collection level, personal connection level. There will always be a space for needing peer review, for needing properly referenced papers and deep technology in papers. That will not go away. It's more about how can we use technology to add, engage, and get key messages across as well. So who knows? Look out. Maybe one of us will be the first of the journals to go down that path. But I think regardless of who it is and why they do it, I think it's an important route, as there are other emerging technologies right now. And I mean, Corrosion Journal has been around for a long time, but only very recently has jumped on social media, and its messages are getting stronger, better, and being more amplified. And it does take time as well, but that's another enabling platform. I think that's here to stay.
At a more practical level, I would just like to add that, and I really, again, thank our colleagues here for their insightful discussion points, all of which I agree with. But I think at a more practical level, corrosion community will need to pay attention to what's being done at NIH, because normally what comes out in the United States as requirements, at least for federally funded grants, will be sort of the NIH leads the way and where they're doing it. So we'll have to look at that. And that brings us to some really basic ideas that I'll bring up, which is just data curation, and something I mentioned earlier, like during the last podcast, which is data cleansing, and a little bit during this podcast. But I think that so just the data curation is interesting for me. So the taxpayers paid for the data if it's a U.S. federal grant, and so the taxpayer should get the data, and the company will get it. But then, there's just what are the boundaries, and really it's a sort of the Wild West of what the boundaries are going to be put on this. And I think they need to have some. For instance, for me, I've even had I said, well, sure, we'll put the data from all the tables that make it into the publication. So if it makes it through peer review, we'll put it up there wherever you want. But some sponsors have actually said, well, we want your bad data too, because somebody can learn from that. And indeed, someone can learn from that. But then how those concepts, so these are little issues, not the grand view of my colleagues, which I certainly agree with, but just what will we do? Will we put bad data up there or not put it up there? Because I don't think that a guest can come in necessarily and look at that and really reconstruct everything you did, like a data accident investigation, to know why it's bad. And so I'm not sure bad data should be put up there. And one very simple notion is just the idea of the data that makes it through peer review. Is something that should be shared, especially when the sponsor dictates that as a stipulation. As far as the machine learning goes and data informatics, I mean, I do think what will happen in the future, and it's only a healthy form of progress. In all of our journals, all of these editors are confronted with papers that are in mature subject areas. And it doesn't mean they shouldn't be published, but there's 100 references on the topic, or maybe more. Stainless steel pitting corrosion, there's probably thousands of references. And so, what's compelling? What are the needs, gaps, and opportunities? And I think some of the machine learning can help to identify that, or the chat GPT. However, it should probably be cited properly. So, one should know when they read the paper that somehow that this condensation of condensed version of what the critical needs, gaps, and opportunities are came from, asking chat GPT, or, this comes from these 100 references that I cite here. And there needs to be, this is all very boring stuff, but I think there needs to be some protocol to this. Otherwise I think it gets out of hand very quickly. But I do think that this sort of data informatics can be healthy if used properly, that it can identify what experiments you can do. If you're seeing some relationship, remember, there's no science in this, as Nick has pointed out. You're basically, it's taking the data that's available. In fact, I think an interesting experiment would be to take out parts of the database that it relies upon. And so these natural language tools, if you take the data out, what conclusion would they get about chromate replacement inhibitor if you were to do this or that, or to the data? If you take out the data from a certain region of the world, or if you take out data from a certain time period, how does that change the result? And so we should all be cognizant of those things. And students, the future engineers, at least at UVA, it looks like they'll all have data science type classes in their curriculum, which is something I cannot say for my generation. But it can be very healthy, because if you say, well, okay, we see these 4 relationships, so maybe you should do your experimental design to see why we see these four relationships. And as Arjan said much earlier in the conversation, it could just be that the correlation is not cause. For instance, what happens on a sunny day is not cause. So it can be very useful, but I think with a little bit of control and a little bit of a protocol, like publication committees that run journals have, can probably keep this from getting out of control very readily. Maybe I'm too optimistic about that.
So if people want to get in touch with you later, what is the best way for them to reach you?
Well, ideally, I would like to meet all of you in person. So this is Arjan Mol. Indeed, I hope we can meet up in a live fashion at a conference or whatever sort of meeting. But else, please drop me an email, and I hope to respond to you at my earliest convenience. So feel welcome.
Yes, also from my side, I'm always happy to discuss corrosion issues. So if you meet me, you can come and we can discuss. And otherwise, also email is probably the best way to reach me. And also, I will try to reply as fast as possible. And if it takes a little bit longer, then send a second email, if in case your first email arrived in a really, really bad time.
Excellent. And I'm Nick here, and happy to be contacted by any means whatsoever through the socials and certainly by email. So I'm looking forward to engaging.
Yes, fantastic. And in my case, John Scully here, JRS8D as in Delta at virginia.edu. But, as my colleagues have mentioned, I go to a lot of different conferences. And feel free to discuss things or reach out to me. Introduce yourself. Please do at a conference. I love meeting people and talking to them about their research or something else if they so desire. And last but not least, Charlottesville is just a pleasant 1.5, maybe 2 hour drive through the countryside from Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. So please feel free to contact us about a visit.
Fantastic. With that concludes our episode for today. I'm Sammy Miles. I'm here with Arjan Mol, Sanna Virtanen, Nick Birbilis, and John Scully. And thanks for listening to another episode of Corrosion Journal's interview series. You can subscribe to AMP Podcasts if you haven't already on Apple, Google, Spotify, and all the major distributors. If you want to learn more about the journal, make sure to visit corrosionjournal.org. You can also find all episodes of AMP podcasts on amp.org. That's ampp.org. We will be back soon with another episode. Thank you for listening.